This dinosaur that I'm drawing is for a track site in Utah. It's from the early Jurassic period, about 165, 170 million years ago, in a formation called the Entrada Sandstone. We don't actually have good skeletal material from North America at this time. So I'm basing this theropod on Megalosaurus and some of the European theropods that were living around the same time. And we're kind of keeping it just general theropod design. As you can see, this is kind of in a tricky perspective. We're kind of almost looking over this theropod's shoulder. And so what I've done is I've traced out this skeletal outline based on a photo I took of actually an Allosaurus skeletal mount, and then I modified things a little bit so that it is more Megalosaurus-like. We don't actually have a complete skull of Megalosaurus. One of the key differences is that there's this horn in front of the eye, which is substantially smaller in Megalosaurids. There's a few other minor differences, but the basic skeletal outline is traced, and I'll go through the main parts and what they are, and how having those drawn first can help you down the line with the drawing. I don't think that you should see every part of a skull in a fleshed out reconstruction of an animal. And, because real animals don't work that way. There might be subtle hints of parts of a skull exposed in a living animal, but theropod dinosaurs in particular suffer in paleo art of having what we would refer to as like a shrink-wrapped design, where they're always drawn looking a certain way, where you can actually see the whole skull underlying. So to go through the different parts of the skull, theropod dinosaurs, they have these big weird holes in their skull. The biggest one is kind of in the middle of the skull. This is called the antorbital fenestra. Ant means in front of or anterior to. Orbital is referring to the orbital bones, the orbit of the eye. Fenestra means window. So the antorbital fenestra, the AOF for short, you'll see that on a lot of skeletal diagrams. It's basically a huge hole going into the sinuses or connecting to the inside of the skull. There would have been likely cartilage and other soft tissue sinuses inside of this, and then this would have been closed over by soft tissue on the outside. In living animals, in birds, some birds will have small antorbital fenestras. Most birds have kind of closed it off, but there's little or no evidence of this on the outside of a bird's skull. Now, between the orbit, which is where the eye sits, and I've kind of loosely sketched in this eye, and the antorbital fenestra, there's this little crest that almost all theropod dinosaurs have some amount of a little crest here. This is formed by the lacrimal bone, and then some species have crests that go onto these frontal bones, these nasal bones. This is a important little detail that a lot of people actually get wrong, is they'll put the lacrimal crest, they'll put it over the eye. That's a common one from like the Jurassic Park movies. The Tyrannosaurus's crest kind of goes over his eye. That's not the case here, or in almost any theropod. The lacrimal crest is just in front of the eye. And what's interesting about it, there's actually a cavity that goes up into it. That's actually would have been an air-filled cavity connected to this antorbital fenestra. So the antorbital fenestra actually kind of expands up into that lacrimal crest. And then the orbit is behind that. Now, theropods are weird in that they have this big spot for their eye, but then the actual orbital fenestra goes well below that. Why that is, I don't really know. It's probably part of a number of things they were doing to lighten up their skulls. These things had huge heads and massive jaws, huge amount of jaw muscle. So they appear to have kind of gotten rid of as much bone as they could while still keeping their skull strong, because they got to carry all that head around without becoming too front heavy and falling on their face. Now, behind the orbital opening, there's the post-orbital bone right here, and then that forms a window with the bones at the rear of the skull, the squamosal and the quadrijugal. And the jugal is, the jugal's kind of like down this area. But this hole is called the post-orbital, the temporal fenestra. Fenestra means window. Temporal refers to like the temporalis region, just like your temple on the side of your head. And then at the top of the skull, which you can't see from this angle, And what I do is I kind of trace the skull in 3 dimensions so you can get a sense of like the 3-dimensional space and make sure the perspective is working. So this would be like the lower jaw here, locking in there. And then this would be the back of the skull here. And this would be where the spinal, the first vertebrae, first cervical vertebrae articulates with the back of the skull. What you can't see is that there's another hole up top. It's called the supratemporal fenestra. Super means above. And basically, this whole structure was filled with jaw muscles. This is a structure we see in birds and in crocodilians and in a bunch of other reptiles. All archosauromorphs have these 2 holes. That's why they're called diapsids. They have a hole at the top of their skull and a hole in the bottom. And there's actually jaw muscles that wrap up through. The jaw muscles attach around the edge of this hole, and then they wrap up into the top of this hole, and then there's jaw muscles that wrap actually inside of the jaw. And then in most reptiles, there's some jaw muscles that actually come outside of the jaw and connect out here. Actually, I say most, but I think all. There's a lot of jaw muscles there. Now, at the back of the skull here, I've kind of loosely traced in these vertebrae. Now, coming off the bottom of dinosaur vertebrae and bird vertebrae and a few other reptiles is these long things we call cervical ribs. They're these sprues of bone that kind of extrude from the vertebral body, and just kind of like, if you see a dinosaur skeleton, they just kind of hang there in the middle of nowhere. What those actually are is where tendons connect to the muscles that move the neck around. So there's muscles that connect to those that run down the neck, and then there's muscles connecting to the spinous processes on the top of the vertebrae. So this whole space in here would have been filled with musculature, and there's a big muscle attachment on the back of the skull that all the neck muscles attach into. So when you flesh all that out, you actually get this massive amount of muscle in the neck behind the head. And then crocodilians have a muscle, which I don't remember the name of it, but there's a muscle that actually helps to close the jaws and kind of stabilize the jaws, and it kind of bulges out behind here. Makes kind of like this jowly-like structure on crocodilians. There's good reason to think that theropod dinosaurs had those as well, and they're probably large in theropods just like they're large in crocodilians. They give a lot of strength to the jaws. So as we're starting to flesh out this skull, one of the things that is surprisingly kind of a point of debate in dinosaur reconstruction, that's the teeth here. The teeth in theropod dinosaurs, I think, would have very likely been covered by a fleshy lip. And there's a few reasons for thinking this. One, that's the most common state of living animals. There are very few living animals who live on land whose teeth hang out of their mouth all the time. There's a few deer who have sharpened fangs that they use for fighting, whose fangs will kind of stick out a little. And then there's, let's see, what else? Boars have tusks that protrude from their mouths. But these things are still mostly covered by lips. In the case of theropod dinosaurs, many of them have actually grooves in the lower jaw that the top teeth kind of fit into. There are these tooth-shaped grooves down here. That would indicate that these teeth were sliding into an impression in the gum tissue. There really isn't enough room between these top teeth and that underlying groove to have gum tissue and skin. It would be pretty surprising if that were the case. So very likely these top teeth would have been covered in a lip. One of the other evidences for lips is that along the margin of the premax and maxilla and across the dentary bone as well, there's all these little pits and pores that in living reptiles and birds are holes in the bone that are innervated with all kinds of blood vessels. And those blood vessels nourish either lips or a beak in birds, which is, a beak is basically just a really hardened set of lips. We don't know exactly what the lips of theropod dinosaurs would have looked like. I think a good thing to reference is modern birds or modern lizards. In the corner of birds' mouths, they have this like flexible tissue that's like, it's part of their beak, but it's this more flexible keratin at the back of their beak. You also look at things like monitor lizards. They have serrated teeth like theropod dinosaurs, and they keep them nice and sharp and protected in a sheath of gums with big fleshy lips hanging down around that. So I think it's most likely that these animals would have had nice big fleshy lips protecting their sharp teeth with delicate serrations on them. At the back of the skull here, again, we'd have this like massive muscle covering things up. So we really wouldn't see much of that that jaw outline. And then we have all this meat of the neck and skin overlying that. That would have completely obscured those underlying bones of the neck. This neck should look like a big tube of musculature, just like modern birds. Now underneath here, we would have had a big trachea going down. If we look at predatory lizards and crocodiles, they have really big flexible tracheas so they can swallow big chunks of food. And then we would expect there to be some skin overlying that, possibly some air sacs in the throat. A lot of reptiles, crocodilians, and all birds have a bunch of air sacs in their throat. And these air sacs serve a variety of functions, but we would expect them to be present in theropod dinosaurs because theropod dinosaurs' bones throughout their skull and their postcranial skeleton are full of these things called pneumatic air sacs. So that we call it pneumaticity. They were basically, their respiratory system was interconnected with their skeletal system. And this may have given them advantages for oxygen efficiency and things like that. So as you can see, we can kind of trace out those underlying bones and then go through and start kind of getting rid of a lot of those details. Now that we have the kind of the proportions right, and we have the overall perspective kind of down. What I like to do is, in order to make sure that perspective is right, once I've kind of traced out those skull bones, it's kind of like use these contour lines to kind of construct the animal from the inside out, right? So, and to kind of constrain our perspective. So we have this animal skull. If you look at like the back of a theropod skull, it's kind of like this box, and then the jaws kind of curve onto the bottom of this box and kind of jut out just a little behind it. And then it articulates with these vertebrae, which would have built a neck that was very much kind of like an oblong cylinder. So I like to draw those sort of cylindrical construction lines for the neck. And then this would be, I like to draw my midline on the animal. So this would be the midline. If this animal had any quills or spines and stuff that stuck up along the midline, we'd kind of keep them along there. And then we continue the outline of the other side of the neck, these curves going over. Now these curving lines aren't going to make it into my final drawing, but they help me to keep things squared away when I'm drawing things like scales and feathers and whatnot. So there's our inside back part of the skull there that we're getting rid of. Now, something I forgot earlier is that just below this these like bones in the back of the skull, there's kind of this notch here behind the quadrate, or above the quadrate and behind the quadrijugal, and that's where the ear would have sat. Now we don't know exactly what dinosaurs' ears would have looked like. Crocodilians have these really weird complex ears. Birds have a much more externally simple looking ears that can actually be quite complex internally. We would expect dinosaurs to have a simple ear opening like a bird, but we don't really know. And with skin coverings and things like that, a lot of the ears may have been pretty obscured by wrinkles of skin or by feathers, which brings me to feathers. In the case of Megalosaurus dinosaurs, there's a decent chance that they were feathered. There's something called Sciuromymis that was discovered in Germany. It's thought to be an early Megalosaur dinosaur, and it's a fuzzy little guy. We also know that plant-eating dinosaurs on the Ornithischian side of the tree, now some call it Ornithiscalida, they are not closely related to birds at all, and they have little quilly feather-like structures. So if they had feathers and early theropods had feathers, and pterosaurs had feather-like structures, it basically indicates that all of these animals, wherever you are on the tree of the Archosauromorpha, there's a possibility of either convergently evolved feather-like structures or feathers derived from a fuzzy or quilly common ancestor. We don't know which it is yet, so it's something to bear in mind. Now, in drawing the eye of your animal is very important because people look at eyes and we're aware of a lot of detail in eyes that we might not notice consciously, but if it's not there, the animal doesn't look realistic. So our perspective again is like a little bit behind this animal, and I want it to be kind of looking into the frame. So we have to really compress the circles that we make this eye out of. Now, most animals' eyes actually aren't, the iris of the eye, the part that you look at, isn't really round. It's kind of flat. And then there's a round lens going over that. Light then hitting that lens will refract inside of it. And you usually get, like if the light's coming from this direction, you'll usually get a highlight on the surface of the eye, and then darker stuff around the edge. And then you'll get kind of a highlight reflecting off of that iris. Now, beneath that, we want to build realistic looking lids. Now, it's a good idea to look at the eyelids of birds and reptiles to get realistic looking lids. The important thing to remember is that, keep everything in perspective, right? So like if you're behind this animal, you're going to see the outside of the eyelid here, and you see the inside of the eyelid here. Now, if the light's coming from kind of in front of the animal, the inside of the eyelid is going to be more in shadow, and it's actually going to cast a little bit of shadow across the top of that eye. And this is kind of, some of these finer details I'll probably go in with a mechanical pencil and refine them substantially. The other thing that goes on with eyes that a lot of paleo artists don't realize is that eyes actually bulge out of the skull in most animals. Humans are kind of weird in that a decent amount of our eye is actually under our cheekbone, or like behind our cheekbones and behind our eyebrows. That's not the case with most birds and reptiles. Most birds and reptiles and a lot of mammals, all that musculature and actual eyeball material, it kind of bulges out of the skull a little ways. This is important because it gives the animals better peripheral vision, and it allows them to look out for predators, and it changes the look of the animal substantially. Crocodiles in the top of their skull have this tiny little eye socket. When you look at a crocodile, their eyes bug way out of their skull. Same things with frogs, birds, a bunch of mammals. Unless there's like a good reason to think that these animals were protecting their eyes with like a shield of bone around it, which is the case with like ceratopsian dinosaurs and tyrannosaurs and armored dinosaurs like ankylosaurs. There's really not a good reason to think that these things didn't have bird-like eyes that kind of bugged out of their skull a little bit. So again, if it's bugging out, if the light's coming from kind of in front, we're going to indicate that bulging out with a little bit of shading here. And then we can start to build in our values as we shade. Now, one of the things I want to bear in mind is that in some of these areas, I'm going to have quill-like structures coming onto the face, so I'm going to kind of suggest my direction of those with some light construction lines there. And then, I'm also going to imagine how those are going to affect the outline of our animal. So like if I've built these construction lines all over the neck to give the sense of the curvature of the neck, I want to like make sure that when I lay the feathering over that, it's going with the curvature, right? So if the neck's bulging up here, my feathers or scales are going to kind of orient this way, and then as I come down the back of the neck, they're going to orient this way. The other thing I need to keep in mind is lighting. If the light is coming from kind of in front of the animal, again, anything that's bulging out of the side of the animal's face is going to cast a shadow on the backside, like back here. This big jaw muscle is going to cast a shadow here, and then we're going to be casting shadows down, and then the back of the neck is going to be partially in shadow as light, isn't reaching it as much as the front of the neck. So I'm kind of defining my values. I'm defining my direction of texture according to both the curvature of the animal's body and the perspective. As I'm working on this like antorbital fenestra area, you'll notice that I try and just like kind of build in the direction that I feel like the animal's skull should be bulging out. And I use photo reference for a lot of this just to make sure like I'm getting kind of the curvature of things right. And then one of the other things to bear in mind is if you look at a lot of birds and reptiles, there'll be a lot of creases and folds and smaller scales and stuff in areas of higher flexibility. So areas like this in the back of the mouth, it's a good idea to like put some extra creasiness in there. Give it a little bit of, give it a feeling of being a more flexible part of the animal's face. Areas like the front of the nose and these crests that would have been on top of the head here, probably less flexible. There's really rough texture on a lot of these theropod crests, which indicate there's probably some really tight-fitting scales or even a keratinous horn-like structure on the front of their crest there. So we wanna use the line work to suggest textures, and with those textures build something that feels believable as an animal. It should be flexible in the right places, and it should be hard and hardened looking in other places. I'm gonna cut in this jaw just a little bit for two reasons. One, to kind of push this perspective of like things narrowing toward the front of the face as it's going away from the camera, but then also looking at my skeletal reference, it looks like I just made the jaw too thick. So one of the things you want to do is constantly be checking your skeletal reference and just looking out for little issues as you go. Because the worst thing and it happens all the time in paleo art, is you'll draw like the whole damn animal, and then you'll look at your skeletal reference at the end and go, oh shit, I completely messed up a huge part of this animal's anatomy, and I like fully drew the whole thing in doing that. And then you either gotta take the art off your website or just endure people's criticism. In some cases you'll make a mistake and then you'll think it's this terrible thing and then learn something new and find out later that, oh, it actually didn't really matter, or we don't actually know what people purported claimed that we knew. So one of the things I'm doing right now is I'm using kind of the side of my pencil more to create looser, more open shading and texturing. The side of my pencil gets worn down in this broader edge. And so I can kind of like lay in softer fields of light and dark. My neighbor's dog is freaking the fuck out. And then I can also use the eraser to kind of like bring things up a level. Now, what I was just doing here is because the light's coming from the front, and we want this neck to feel like it's kind of bulging out, I'm taking off some of the darkness here so that it feels like it's reflecting more light. Feathers tend to reflect a lot of light. And so if this thing is going to be a large fuzzy theropod, we want that feather plumage to be catching the light and creating bright highlights. Now this thing is going to be colored digitally, so I don't have to worry too much about certain things. My main thing with these graphite drawings is trying to get the values set really nicely so that we want it to have like almost like a black and white photographic quality. We can go in and put tints of color into these details later when I color it digitally. For right now, what we want to make sure is that the overall feel of the lighting is working. Something I often do, and we'll probably do with this one, once I've got like my basic architecture laid out like this, I've got my curvature, I'm starting to get a sense of like the form is taking shape. What I'm gonna do now is go in and I'm gonna use my finger to define large scale shaded areas. We know the back of the neck needs to be shaded. You know this bottom area here where not much light is getting is gonna be shaded. And so I'm going in and I'm smudging out these big areas, basically to say, okay, this is what I'm gonna make really dark. Everything else, I'm gonna make my highlights really light with the eraser. I'm gonna leave those mostly intact. I need some more light up here. The front of this crest should be pretty illuminated. Front of the nose should be catching a lot of light. And then we can kind of make it bulge here. Top of the lip should be catching light. So now we're starting to kind of like sculpt into the page the different levels of depth based on keeping our direction of lighting in mind. I could go wilder with these plumes, and I think I'll do something more decorative somewhere around here. Maybe I'm just thinking, because dinosaurs have all these weird display features. It's fun to include little speculative touches. I mean, so much of this ultimately ends up being speculative in terms of coloration and stuff. So I may go through and figure out some kind of a speculative display feature somewhere along the way. Maybe I'll give it like some weird dewlappy thing off to the side here, like chicken waddles. Why? Because why not? We know displays from the skeletal record. We know that displays were an important part of these animals' lives. And so this guy doesn't have a real crazy crest. Maybe it was doing something, using some other part of its body for its main display feature. But we don't know. Okay, so this thing is starting to take shape. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit it with a Prismacolor marker to define some of those dark shadows. One of the things I personally struggle with is not making my darks dark enough. In order to force myself to be more bold with my shading, I've started using Prismacolors and sometimes watercolor washes to define the darkest areas of shadow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to define these darkest areas. So under the jaw here should be the darkest, because the light's coming from the top in the front. This area down here is going to be catching very little light. It's going to be catching the bounce light, and it's going to be catching the ambient light that's diffused through the clouds in the air. Everything else is not going to be getting hit by direct sunlight. So in order to set up an effective amount of contrast, we got to define those dark areas, like really create that contrast, because otherwise it's just not gonna pop if I'm just allowed to work in graphite. It will very often I won't be bold enough, and then if you don't have enough contrast in your piece, it just doesn't pop like you want it to. So what I do is I force myself to go deeper and darker by using these Prismacolor markers to define the darkest areas.
So I finished the drawing for this lesson, and when I dropped it into my layout, it just wasn't working. And I don't know if it was because I was distracted by trying to talk to the camera and give a lesson, or if I just did a bad job. It's kind of hard to say. So I went back to the drawing board and focused on making some rough thumbnail sketches just to get a sense of what are the key lines and details which tell your eye that this is the right three-dimensional shape in perspective, that this is a theropod head looking into the scene. And then in the final drawing, I made sure to focus on getting those key details right.